23 years ago, more or less to this day, I was a younger person. And I was being educated at Yale University, which is an accredited four-year college in southern Connecticut. And I was not majoring in anything other than wasting my parents' money and taking classes where they would either show movies or play jazz music, which was why I took the history of jazz class with John Zwed, any of you following along on Yale history. And the primary attraction of this history of jazz class was the jazz. And then the secondary attraction was that it was in a theater like this with a balcony where you could hide, depending on your hangover level. And the tertiary attraction was that if the jazz got a little too hot, a little too Ornette Coleman, and not good for the hangover, you could just walk out the back and no one would notice to recline on any of the beautiful green leather sofas that they had in this hallway there and take a nap, which I would do about every other course. And then, one time I was lying on that sofa, and there was a door open to another smaller classroom, and in this classroom, a young professor, maybe a graduate student, was testing out a lecture that he was giving on why comedy is funny. It was a psychology class of some kind. And to illustrate his lecture, he was using scenes from a television show called Fawlty Towers. I know. I woke up from my nap because I love Fawlty Towers. As an even younger person, I had seen Fawlty Towers. It was the natural progression from the total brain reshaping that had been my experience of watching Monty Python for the first time. Changed the way I thought about comedy and the world. Loved John Cleese. My eyes opened. And both shows had always been heroic to me for their intense, unrelenting funniness. A funniness that required no explanation. And yet, this young professor was gamely trying to explain why jokes are funny, talking about the class anxieties and the generational anxieties, and the tension that increased as Basil Fawlty attempted to rescue himself from some humiliation of his own making, and then the cathartic eruption of laughter that the audience would provide itself as a consolation when that tension would refuse to break. Gamely, he tried to explain this to the audience of young students who just wanted him to shut up and let them watch more of the Fawlty Towers. They were so mad at this human who was speaking words in between the thing that they had wanted to see and needed no explanation or no introduction. They hated him, and that is why you will now hate me. Because John Cleese needs no introduction. If you are here and you don't know who he is, you require medical attention. And the fact that I am here to pose questions to him is unfathomable to me. There is no explanation for it other than it's just one more of the weird lottery winnings I've enjoyed unfairly in my life, which include getting to go on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and meeting the President of the United States and George R.R. Martin and being on Battlestar Galactica and being relatively healthy and having nerd children. All those blessings that I say atheistically that I don't deserve, and this is just one more way that I am incredibly lucky, and I'm sorry. For those of you who require any context, my name is John Hodgman. I'm on The Daily Show sometimes. That's all you need to know because I don't matter. What does matter is that one of my personal comedic and human heroes, John Cleese, is standing over there, and pretty soon he's going to start walking over here once you start applauding. Let's go. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for coming to the viewing.
The trouble is, I'm so deaf I couldn't hear what you were saying. sounded funny. Have you got it written down anywhere? Ah! Thank you very much.
Do you have there's a pen? I'll sign it for you.
2 pages, isn't it?
No, these are other things that I'm going to ask
right.
you about. These are the questions.
Okay. Oh, how lovely.
Why are jokes funny?
Why are...
Oh, hello.
That's a very interesting question. I think that the Cats and the Tempatonis composed an opera called the Vogeljuices. There's to be discussed upon a part of Isaac Cruz together, die Moedsleben, the Unbound. So, shows our daughter vision an auditory slope of functional resultant reflectation, juices, corresponding blip mortalizers, but that all comes under code as electric binary certification, which you will underlies in our professor course. And multi-centric combinators superless the deviating lunsometry double Dutch, making connotation together the slib, temperance, and expendency.
I've heard that argument before. I can't help but feel that it's somewhat evasive.
People, you see, they always confuse humor with laughter. And
and I've been making a terrible mistake.
yes, but you see, if you meet very dear old friends that you haven't seen for a long, long time, then there's a lot of laughter. And there's nothing very funny being said. It's an expression of joy and happiness and just sheer goodwill.
I've read about these things.
You read about these things, that's right. We used to have them in England until about 1650, and then the Puritans got into power before we were able to kick them out. And
my people, Massachusettsians,
that's
we call
right,
them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Puritans, yes. But we got rid of them. I can't remember where they went. But,
Me neither.
but quite seriously, when people talk about laughter or humor, they're slightly separate things. They overlap. But you can make a baby laugh, which fascinates me, by sort of peeping at it like that and then peeping at it like that. And then the last time, you peep at it that side and a baby will laugh. Well, it's not really a joke. Do you see what I mean?
Well, part of that is that babies are stupid.
Well, I just say not well educated.
Yeah. It's true. It's a shame, really.
Yes, it's a shame.
Please
Please
donate to our College for Babies fund.
And then we educate them, which makes the problem even worse.
Yeah. Well, what you perhaps were unable to hear in the wings was that.
Well, you want me to?
No,
sorry, later. I'll do that later.
And you know, I only brought it up because I thought what I was saying was very interesting. Mm-hmm. And
well, you're getting a lot of laughs, which I wasn't that pleased with.
No. 35. I four-walled the house. These are all shills. Yeah. Please don't confuse their laughter with my humor. No. When I was in college, there was a professor that I wandered in on a class, as I did, who was trying to explain why comedy is funny using scenes from Fawlty Towers.
Seriously?
Very seriously, and I think you're owed some royalties, certainly.
Yes.
But it was an impossible task because everyone who was taking the course just wanted to watch the show because funny is self-evident. You know, in a way.
Well, it is and it isn't. You see, one of the things I do with my one-man show is I do show clips from various things like the Black Knight, and I only show about 6 or 8 things.
So you can take a break.
Yeah.
Right.
Lou break, actually. Well, I'm 75, you know?
Yeah, very well.
That's 8 or 9 a performance. So, what happened was I would sit and watch the front row of the audience, and what fascinated me was that how much they laughed at different times. Because we always, if we sit in an audience, you know, laughter's infectious, thank God. So we tend to think that everybody laughs at the same things, but if you start studying it, you realize just how subjective a sense of humor is, and that in this front row I will be watching, those guys will laugh at that, and then they'll laugh at that, and somebody else will laugh at something else, and it's much more subjective than you think.
Well, in this book that I presume you hired a team to write.
14 of them.
I could detect all of their different voices. It was like reading an amazing conversation.
The terrible thing I learned as a result of entering publishing the first time is that 90% of celebrity autobiographies are ghosted. 90%.
Yeah, and if I had my way, it would be 99%.
Is that right?
With the one acceptable percentage, including you, because it's wonderfully written.
It is. It is. Thank you.
Well, it's very funny, but it's very candid. It's very
Yes.
revealing, and it's very thoughtful about the creative process.
Yes,
and
I think
in
so.
ways that I found to be totally fascinating, including this issue of you see enough crowds, you start to learn about the psychology of audiences.
That's what the rules of comedy are, and it worries me sometimes that they may be changing.
Tell me more.
Well,
Because I like you, I'm an only child.
right?
And so I like to know what the rules are.
Yes,
So that I can
yes.
follow them
Yes.
perfectly so that I can be loved and adored by everyone all the time.
Yes, that's
I
right.
need total approval at all
Absolutely.
times. Right? That was the
But
thing.
you're,
That was the big
you're
takeaway from this book.
relatively young.
What's that?
How old are you?
I'm just relatively young.
Yeah. How relatively young, or even relatively old?
I am.
are you?
I am relatively within a year of 42 and 44.
Well, then
Somewhere in between.
You're a child in arms. You are.
Thank you, Daddy.
You're sort of 42. God, what I would give
No,
to be
40.
43.
43. Yeah,
43.
That's
I
It's
was
a lot different.
75 last Monday. 75.
happy birthday.
You can get applause at my age just by breathing.
Hooray! You're almost done. Hooray!
Well, I am almost done.
No.
Yes, but I shall be dead quite soon, And
In fact, we have a little announcement to make. Not even John knows this.
when I did my my tour in Canada, somebody suggested we call it Last Chance to See John Cleese before he dies.
I think sometimes audiences need that kind of impetus. Because one of the rules that I have observed about comedy
Yeah?
is that there is too much of it.
Too much?
There is what has happened in all media is the democratization of the internet
Yes?
allows everyone to be a comedian, often
Yes.
the same comedian.
Yes.
But there's so much comedy, so much brilliant comedy, so many different ways for comedy to be out there, like art and so forth. And audiences are overwhelmed with choices, spoiled with choices. And that when you go to do a show that you've worked on, sometimes they're like, well, I'll stay until the next person comes. But if you say, I'm going to die, if you don't come see this show, that really, you know what I mean?
Well, calling it that was a marketing device.
Yes. When you say the rules of comedy are changing,
Well,
which rules are changing and how?
Well, I think that the rules of film comedy have been changed by the fact that very few people now go to the cinema except basically young males who seem to make most of the choices rather than young females. And that means that the humor has to appeal to a very narrow band of people.
Monstrous children.
Yes, monstrous children who would go and see, now what was it called? A Hangover, you see. Now, Hangover is a sort of ultimate movie for young men because it's about Las Vegas. And it's about going there and probably, I only saw some of it, screwing around and using drink and drugs and all that kind of thing. Now, my daughter, who's
I think you got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very sad when the framework of reference for humor becomes as limited as it does. My daughter, who's 30, does very good stand-up. Camilla, I mean, she's actually very good. But we have discussions because I say when I go and see her, you know, and she does a set and everyone else does a set, then the jokes are basically sex, drugs, booze, gambling, eating disorders, celebrities, television shows, and I'm struggling.
Fingers.
Fingers.
Fingers is another one.
Fingers is another.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting at is there's very, very few areas now. You know, if I've always wanted to make a film about 1776.
Sure.
But most of the people who go to the cinema, if you said 1776, they would say, well, that rings a bell. That means there are these vast areas of possible comedy that you can't go to because the audience simply doesn't have the information.
Well, certainly not in a mass form that would go to a movie theater and,
That's right.
and support the budget of a major motion picture.
That's exactly right. So that means that in a sense of humor, or what works as comedy, is quite different now from what it was 40 years ago.
And coming up in comedy, I mean, contrast your experience coming up in comedy versus, say, your daughter's as a stand-up comic. Now, you were never a stand-up comic. You were a writer and
I
a
used
sketch
to do
writer.
cabaret, which meant that I would go out and do monologues in character. And I
Right.
did that a little bit because this was the days when you will not believe this, the income tax rate in the UK was 83%. Can you believe that? 83%.
There, we have someone from Occupy Wall Street up in the cheap seats, naturally. Can we further obstruct their view, please? Can we move a pillar?
So what the advantage of doing occasional cabaret is that I got paid in pound notes in a little brown envelope, which nobody knew about. And and it was worth it in those days because effectively it was extraordinary, that rate of tax, because it meant that at 9 o'clock on Monday morning you started working for the government, and then at 10:30 on Friday they said for the rest of the week you can work for yourself. It was extraordinary to think that was the case, but that was why I used to do it, as a way of getting a little bit of cash that I didn't pay tax for. But I found it very difficult because there are so many things that can kill comedy if you're just going out into a space that you've never been before. Now, this is lovely. I mean, this is a fabulous shape, this theater. You know, I can see the faces in the back row, and that gives me a sense of intimacy, although it's, what, nearly 800, right?
I didn't count.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's fantastic. Yeah,
would you like me to have
no,
them turn around?
No, it's fine,
I mean,
but the lights are good. You see, the lighting is good, the sound is good. And the one thing that can really kill you, which is too big a space between you and the front row, that's not a problem here in this beautiful theater. Those things you couldn't control. So I hated doing it because there were so many things that could kill you stone dead that you couldn't control.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me was there's a passage in the book where you point out that, you know, you grew up, you went to Cambridge, you joined the Footlights. You started doing sketch comedy and monologues there, went to the West End, went to Broadway. You were in another Broadway production. You can all read all about it in the book. Please buy 2 copies. It's great. I won't go through the whole thing, but that your stage performance career was really limited to that initial time.
Terribly limited.
Performing with the Footlights and the troops that came out of that, and then obviously with Monty Python in the 70s up until 1980.
But you see, the fascinating thing about comedy is that it's like everything else. It's so dependent on the technology. I mean, the nicest theatres in England were built in 1870 before the invention of the microphone.
Right.
So everything had to be intimate enough for the human voice to be able to reach the back of the theatre. So you have these beautiful theatres. Then when you invent the mic, then you try and get as many people as you possibly can, and they're so tiny in the distance you can't really see them. So technology takes advantage of a lot of things. When I was growing up, Peter Cook was the greatest genius, comedy genius,
yes,
right?
Yes, please. Yes.
You know about it.
Oh, yes, yeah.
He's just wonderful. And he could sit on the front of stage and just make the audience howl with laughter. And just making it up almost as he went along. But you see, you couldn't do that now because the stage doesn't get the attention that it used to. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Now, if you want to make movies now, according to my lovely friend who what was it called? Oh, yeah, there was an animated movie called The Croods.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and I co-wrote the early drafts of that.
Oh,
It
I
was
didn't know.
completely different after. But the guy I wrote it with, Kirk D'Amico, is lovely. And Kirk said, well, they're making 3 types of movies now. They make the blockbusters, they make the animated films for families, and they make the romantic comedies, the rom-coms for people in their 20s, you know? And that's really what gets financed in the film business. Now, what's the point of me trying to make a movie that I'm interested in if that's the basic economic structure of movies?
Amazon will give you a web series in 2 seconds if you want.
Well, that's what I mean, but I would never think of that, you see.
Okay.
And
I'll
in
call them.
television in England, there's not a single television company there that I would want to work for. I mean, they don't want to do the sort of things I'm interested in. So the funny thing is that having started on stage, exactly as you described, I'm now coming back to the fact that I like stage, and I'm now going to be writing for the stage, not for television or not for film. So it's strange that there's been a complete circle in my career of 50 years back to the stage.
And what is your enjoyment of the stage now?
Well, what I like now is the reality of the transaction between us and the audience here. You know, it's completely real. I know if a joke has worked, and if you don't laugh, I know it hasn't. And I like the reality of that. But what I'm really interested in is going back, because the technology of the stage is still pretty much the same. You know, it's still basically a proscenium arch of some kind.
Right.
And then people acting in character and structure and all that stuff. The other medium I adore is radio, and I think radio is coming back now.
Oh, well, I mean,
Right?
yes, indeed. I
You,
mean,
what do you think?
well, sorry.
No,
You're right. I apologize. You say what you think.
no, I'm actually asking. I want to know. I think it's coming back because it's cheap and it's good.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, you know, with the internet and podcasting, more people are listening to non-visual entertainment probably ever before in history.
Yeah.
And some of it is spectacularly good. You know.
And what's so wonderful about radio is it's all about the script and the performance.
Right.
You know, it's not about, oh, you've got a bit of lint on your jacket or we got a reflection of something. You know what it is? It's about the essentials, script and performance, and the simplicity really appeals.
But no laughter. I mean, unless you're doing a live broadcast.
Well, I did a lot of live radio shows.
Yeah.
You see, I used to perform in a theater that was a perfectly straightforward theater, about 500 or 600 people. It didn't have a big balcony like that, and we used to do it. It was called, I'm Sorry, I'll Read That Again. Brooke Taylor and Bill Oddie and people like that did it with me, and it was a terrific fun doing it with the audience. But you can also do it, as you know, in a studio. And the lovely thing again is it costs next to nothing. So you can spend time on it and make it really good. Whereas television is always this, I mean, it's lovely to go on Jon Stewart tonight, and I really enjoyed it because I thought he was great. I mean, you worked with him for how long?
7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
And there's something, I mean, he's enormously bright.
Oh, one of the most perceptive interviewers.
Yes.
And a very gentle lover, and just. So
He just
so I've read in the pamphlets he hands out, he leaves around the office.
You just can't control yourself, can you?
No, I can. I mean, this is addictive, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about. So you're an only child.
An only child.
Many times when you ask a comedian, or someone in comedy, like, why were you funny? And there's a very common answer, which is like, I had to be funny in order to get attention in my house full of brothers and sisters.
Oh.
Or to make my parents love me, or to get attention at the table. I had to be funny to compete for attention. But we, as only child, know what it is to not have to compete for parental attention at all, and how much better that is than any other human. And there's so much in the book about your growing up, and you know, that you almost got into comedy by accident by reading this book. You were studying for law. I think you took a wrong turn or fell over something, and then were suddenly in the common rooms of the footlights, and you were like, I like this, and then you made a career out of it.
Yes.
It can't be true that you must have had some drive to comedy specifically, or
Well, there's
else you wouldn't
certain
have done
things
it.
I can remember that I can't find it hard to explain. I remember once when I was ill with a sore throat, and I used to get a lot of those in the English weather. And I remember in an exercise book beginning to write a script for my two favorite comedians who were not very good. You'd never heard of them. It was an odd thing to do for an 8-year-old. I didn't write it for very long, but it was then when I got to Clifton College, my public school, which is sort of 13 to 18, we used to get given a little blue book, and it had all the information about the teachers and who was in what house and all that kind of information. And I used to fill every tiny little gap of blank paper with the latest joke that I'd heard that I thought was really funny.
Yeah.
You know? And nobody else was doing that. Yet the thought of becoming a comedian, if somebody said, are you going to go into show business, I would have thought they were insane, because I was more likely to become the Pope or a matador. It just wasn't on the radar. It just wasn't.
Well, it's never too late. Popes are resigning all the time. You could.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, you might get in there still.
I think we got a good one. I think we get a good one every 30, 40 years.
I thought you were going to say every 300 or 400.
No, I remember John the 22nd, and I thought he was good news.
That was a good Pope, you guys.
Yeah. Well, it's a good name.
Yeah, that's right, indeed.
Yeah.
What was more ridiculous seeming to you, the idea that you would go into show business or comedy specifically?
Oh, I don't think there was a distinction. I mean, the idea of becoming an actor of any sort was just, it was not what people did. I mean, it was a low...
Some people did.
Yes, but not from Western Superman, I promise you.
Yeah.
I've only met two people in my life who did anything in Western Superman. One was an excellent London chef.
Yes.
And the other was a crooked politician. He is Lord Western Superman.
Oh.
He's been to jail and he's still a lord, don't ask me. Where were we?
Well, I guess.
It's a lower middle class. My dad sold insurance.
Yeah.
My mum's best friend's husband was the manager of a shoe shop. The people who were lawyers and accountants were a little socially above us, but that was sort of within my range. My dad was hoping I would become an accountant. Actually, at one stage, he wanted me to become an actuary. Do you know what an actuary is?
Yeah.
They study probability.
Probabilities of death.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And the definition...
That's how we figured out when you're going to die. I've got it written down.
And the definition of an actuary is someone who found accountancy too exciting. And so they wanted me to do things like that.
Yeah.
And so when I said I wanted to go to Cambridge, and I actually got in on science, and I suddenly realized that the people at Cambridge who were studying science were interested in it. Which meant I didn't.
That must have been some comfort to them.
Yes, and I'd never studied anything I was interested in. I always thought that the English education was teaching you willpower, which was how to concentrate on something in which you had absolutely no interest. In fact, if I ever met anybody who was interested in one of the subjects, I felt he was kind of cheating, you know. So I got to Cambridge, I couldn't become a scientist, and I said, well, what else can I do? And they said, well, not much, because you don't have the qualifications. I said, well, what can I do? And they said, well, you can be an economist, or that you can go into law. So I said, I'll do law. And then, as you quite correctly said, I happened to get into the Footlights by accident, and I found they were the nicest bunch of people at Cambridge. They were very sort of non-stuck-up, and they weren't posh, and there was an interesting mix of subjects and classes, and they were relaxed, and they had obviously a nice sense of humor. And that's why I started to spend all my time in the clubroom. And
what was interesting about what you wrote in the book is that none of them intended to go into show business.
None of them.
And I had forgotten that your writing partner and fellow Pythonite, Graham Chapman, became a physician.
He became a qualified doctor.
And did he perform surgery on you or anything, just for fun? Because
We wanted to practice on me, but he was short of anesthetic, so I don't know what's going on.
I mean, you were to be a lawyer. He well after you guys were professionally writing, he was still learning to be a physician.
Yes, that's right. All the time we were writing for Peter Sellers, he was still completing his exams. And Brooke Taylor, I don't know if you know him, or Bill Oddie from the Goodies. One of them was going to be a teacher, other was going to go to advertising, another great friend was going to also go to teaching, David Hatch. So none of us thought this was going to happen. But we the Footlights had their own club room, which was an incredible advantage, because artistic people aren't frightfully good at organizing things. So at Oxford, if they wanted to do a show, they had to sort of find a theatre and hire lights. And we had a little theatre, and we used to do 2 shows a term, because that's what had always been done. So everyone in the club would do a sketch or a monologue or something like that. And then at the end of the year, there would be a 2-hour show at the Professional Theatre in Cambridge, which is called the Cambridge Footlights Review.
Yeah.
And the second year I got into it, and the third year it just happened to be a really good show. Again, luck, John, because the other guys in the show were very good. And in fact, 2 of them got much better reviews than I did. Nobody spotted me. The only person who thought I was funnier than everyone else was Graham Chapman.
Yeah.
But the critics are picked out too. And this little show got taken from Cambridge and put in the West End for 5 months.
That's the London equivalent of Broadway.
And, you know, there we were performing every night to, 600 or 700 people. And I was making nearly £100 a week. And it was an extraordinary change. And I wrote to the lawyers that I was supposed to have joined.
You had a job offer.
I had a job offer from a very posh firm of lawyers.
And you were to be paid how much a week?
£30 a week. No, 12.
Oh.
And the BBC offered me 30. So I thought, I was never interested in the fucking law anyway. So what am I going to do? And I joined show business. And you see, people always say, well, what did your parents say? And the great thing was I joined the BBC. And there was a pension scheme, you see. So I was able to say, oh, look, there's a pension, you see. And all this kind of, and you won't believe this.
That's your 83% tax rate at work.
Yes. Right.
They could outbid law firms for writers of radio comedy.
Well, that's the way it is.
Yeah.
That's the way the world goes. Bankers and singers are the
But
rich
was the decision that easy as £30 here, £12 here?
No, it was something I wasn't that keen on the law. It was just I'd sort of fallen into everything I'd ever done by accident, and I suddenly saw an escape, and it was going to be fun, and I could work at the BBC and not wear a collar and tie, and I like writing.
Yeah.
So it was a no-brainer, really.
But in your book, this is a wonderful story about your journey into comedy, up to and including the beginnings of the formation of Monty Python. And also, it's a personal journey of self-discovery.
Yeah.
I like you go from being an intensely uncomfortable and shy individual to a relatively non-self-loathing functional human by the end of the book.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Is that unfair of me to say?
No, I think that's fairly.
And I say that with great admiration for the self-examination that goes through this
thank
book,
you.
Because it's really interesting to me.
I've got to tell you, the Americans played a very large part in my life.
How so?
Well, I'll tell you a story that's not in the book. I'll tell you a story that's not in the book. I was quite good at cricket, which is a sort of interesting version of baseball. You know?
Well, I like any sport that you can play with a sweater on, so that's clearly you're not going to be working up much of a sweat if you can be wearing outer clothes in the springtime.
I'm going to acquaint this ignorant bunch of thugs with a fact.
You can project your feelings for me onto them as much as you like. I'd love to learn about the slower, more sedentary form of baseball.
Well, you see, one of the things that we do in England is we play other nations. You see what I mean? The Americans.
I can't believe you're the only person in the world who would corner me into defending sports.
Well,
American sports. Plural, by the way, sports.
Well, I got you cornered, haven't I? You can't get out of it now.
Go on.
And you see, when we're in England, we play other countries. Like, for example, as you know, you have the World Series, but I gather you didn't invite Belgium this year. You know, and then you have American football, because nobody else plays it. Right? And it's called football, and only one person in each team is allowed to kick the fucking thing. Why don't you call it handball? It's all about hands. People catch it and throw it and run with it. It's hands.
We already had a handball.
Fucking feet are on the end of your legs. That's what you do with your feet. And you carefully avoid playing anything that anyone else plays, except for golf, and we beat you at that regularly. So that's
the other sweater-wearing sport that I like.
But what Americans cannot understand is that when we play international matches against other nations...
I've heard of them.
Yes. At cricket, they are called test matches.
Sure.
And they last for 5 days. And at the end of them, there can still be a tie. Now, you see...
And that's just the test. That's not even the real thing. Excuse me.
So where were we?
So anyway,
you
were telling me a story that wasn't in the book.
I was in the cricket team.
You were in the... Yes.
I was in the cricket team, and during my last year, I'd formed a friendship with a guy called Jim Wickenden, and he was an American, and he was the only American in the school. Yes, he did. Jim had come over to do a year's work, and I liked the guy very much. And at the last match of the season, which we had at Lord's, which is like, you know, the home of cricket, we actually had a cricket match at Lord's. Yeah. And I was saying goodbye to him, and I was very fond of the guy, and he said, "Give me a hug." Now, I had not realized he was a homosexual, you see. Now, what I'm getting at was that I hugged him, and suddenly I thought, this is better than this awful English caution about any kind of physical contact. And I was terribly moved by that moment, that there was affection, physical affection, and nobody was going, "Oh, God, it's sexual." You see what I mean?
Right.
And then I married several Americans. I can't remember how many, but... Anyway, the point about that was that they made salads. So I started to eat more healthily. And B, they all participated in psychotherapy. And so I got into therapy about 30 years earlier than anyone else would have done in England, because in those days it was, you were English, you didn't have therapy.
No, and all of the psychotherapists were getting money off the dole because of 83% tax. They weren't working.
You couldn't work, there was no work there at all.
Right.
So there was such a shame about going to see a psychiatrist. I mean, I remember mother when she heard I was seeing a therapist, she said, but if you're going to a therapist, you must be crazy. You know? And that was that prejudice. So it helped me to get into therapy. And then I discovered that this sort of rather academic interest that I'd always had in the human mind was actually because I was fascinated how mind worked.
Sure.
And I met people who understood how people's minds worked and who could predict their behavior better than anyone I'd ever come across. And that was something that had fascinated me since I was 15, but I didn't know it.
And did studying the mind offer you a new perspective on what you had been doing in comedy for, at that point, however many years?
I think so, yes. I read certain explanations of what comedy is about. There's a book called Laughter by Henri Bergson.
Yes.
Which I think is...
I read the Wikipedia page on that today after you mentioned it in your book, yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And I just think he gets something absolutely right, which is that humans are risible. One should laugh at people when their behavior is inappropriate. when it becomes automatic and unthinking and not appropriate, or what he calls mechanical. And I think that's a brilliant interpretation of a lot of humor. And then there was a guy called Arthur Koestler who wrote a book called The Act of Creation. And he talks about the emotional aspect of how you have to build up a certain kind of tension and then release it with the punchline.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff fascinated me because I was able to compare it with my own experience when I laughed and when audiences laughed. So I got into it that way and then got much more interested in the emotional stuff because most of the emotional rules that I learned when I was young and Western Superman were just wrong.
Yeah.
Just wrong.
Well, the thing about laughter is that it is atavistic. I mean, it's profoundly unexplainable, and the only thing that is equivalent to is a shriek of terror. It just comes from some place that is uncontrollable. And I find that doing comedy is a weird experiment with everyone's lizard brains here in order to find what it is that's going to produce that almost involuntary, audible test of humor, you know.
Yes, but I think you and I have a different perspective on this, quite
Well,
seriously,
we're
which
sitting
is
here.
fine. Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I think to some extent, although the inspiration has got to be a creative one, I think you then need a lot of technique in order to make the joke happen in the right way, right? And that technique can to some extent be understood consciously.
One of the things I found really interesting was the description of the time that you had to give a very complicated monologue to a camera. I think it was on one of the David Frost shows.
Right.
And you felt your brain shut off, and then it automatically took over and performed the monologue for you.
That's right.
And I was fascinated by that experience of being convinced that you're going to fail and your brain not letting you do it.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the most important things when you're dealing with any kind of public appearance is to take into account anxiety. Now, right at the moment, I feel minimal anxiety because I met you before the show and I knew we would enjoy each other. And I know that these people are here because they don't hate me. You see what I mean? Now, when you're young...
We did give them a questionnaire before they came in.
Well, yeah, that's right. But what I mean is they would not have forked out money to
Right.
come and see me if they thought I was no good or not funny, because they would have said no. They don't say, you know, oh, it's Cleese, he's awful, let's buy 6 tickets. So they're pre-selected to be friendly. So all the things that make you anxious or make me anxious, and I used to become uncontrollably anxious, which you'll talk about in the book, they're all absent now. And this is a very friendly thing, nice place, thing to do, just to chat.
Well, and you know, in terms of writing, one of the things that really struck me in the book was you figured out a way to build in panic into the writing process. You had like 2 rules for writing, and one was get panic out of the way early.
Well, yeah, get your panic in early.
Right.
I mean, this is good advice to any student. Don't panic 4 days before the exams. That's no use to you. Panic at the beginning of the year. Then you can use that fear as energy to study. Do you see what I mean? And if you're starting a piece of work, panic about it as soon as you can, because that will give you the energy to start on it. And I find that I very seldom panic about anything I'm writing now because I panic right at the start. And I plan very carefully where I'm going to have to be on a certain date and where I'm going to have to be on this date. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And that way I get it. But the fear of being in front of audiences is so interesting. I taught a few acting classes at UCSB when I was in Santa Barbara. And on the very first class, I sat with this very bright bunch of 19, 20, 21-year-olds. I mean, delightful and very good, very talented. And I talked to them about anxiety, and they said to me afterwards, in 4 years of studying drama at UCSB.
So sorry. Everything's fine.
All right?
That was an alarm that I was supposed to set for when I was supposed to say something.
Oh,
And-
what,
No, finish your
well, let me
thought.
just finish.
I was just embarrassed.
You're not a Muslim.
I'll tell you a story that's not in the book.
All right. So I said to them, let's talk about anxiety. And afterwards they said, it is such a relief. In 4 years here studying drama, no teacher, no professor has ever mentioned the word anxiety. And it is absolutely central to getting out in front of an audience.
Yeah.
You know, and it's only academics who could teach drama without talking about it. you see what I mean?
Yeah. The little alarm was just to say that, to remind that we're having a Q&A session.
Yes, whenever you like.
Soon. And there were question cards to fill out, and we're going to collect them if they have not been done so already. If you have a question, you should fill out the card. And we'll collect them and we'll go over it. But,
okay.
I wanted to ask you...
so somebody's collecting them now, are they?
I see people
yes,
wandering around getting the cards.
And we will do our very best to answer 2% of them, yes.
You just performed with Monty Python and what do you call the arena there? O2 or Oxygen?
The O2.
The O2.
O2, yeah.
To,
the O2.
To more than 800 people, 16,000.
16,000. Can you believe that?
Which and for over several nights.
Yeah.
And that must have been an extraordinary experience for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that I was thinking about reading your book, you're talking about the pleasure of performing, getting a chance to perform the same sketches over and hearing how the audience responds and changing them and retesting things. Now, when you're performing with Monty Python, those are sketches you've done many times before. You know them very well. But did you hear them in a different way at all over those courses, those performances at the O2 Stadium?
Well, we knew the material so well, and we'd done it on stage in front of 1,000 people many times.
Right.
We'd done in New York. We did City Center, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that was not what was strange. What was strange, and it was I'd never had this experience before. I always, because I was a neurotic perfectionist, I always wanted to do everything perfectly. You know?
I love how you're using the past tense, because that's where I want to get eventually. It was.
Yeah, well, but
Yeah.
it changed. It's
Yeah.
changed as a result of that experience. And what you're saying is that when you first are lucky enough to get in front of an audience night after night after night, you can carry out a number of small experiments about how to make a joke work. You know, one night you can take a bigger pause, or next night a shorter pause, or you can drop one line, or you can do it with more anger or with less anger. You see what I mean? And it's like a psychological experiment.
Right.
You keep doing it in different ways until you learn how to make it work. So that's what I used to do. And then I wanted to present a perfect performance and do it as well as I could. What I discovered at the O2, it was quite different. Because on the second night I made a mistake. And you know Eddie Izzard?
I've certainly know his work. Yes.
He's wonderfully funny, and he's a great pal of the Pythons. He came to 7 of the shows, and I'd blown a line in the previous sketch, but it was very funny. Terry Jones in the opening number had been playing the guitar, and then he'd taken the guitar off and put a jacket on and come out to do a sketch with us called The Four Yorkshiremen. And what he didn't know is that he'd cut his eye on the guitar. So we started doing the sketch, and I suddenly looked at it, and he had blood pouring down the... And he didn't know he'd cut it, so he started doing this with his hand because he thought there was something going on. So he now was sort of red-handed, literally. And we were all astonished. We thought, well, what? We didn't know how he'd cut himself, you know. And we blew a couple of lines. So I said to Eddie Izzard, sorry about that. And he said, no, you don't understand. I said, what are you talking about, Eddie? He said, they've heard you do the sketch correctly many times. It's much more fun for them now if you make a mistake or do it, because it makes it unique to the occasion.
Yeah.
And I'd never thought of entertainment in that form before, and Eddie was absolutely right. So from then on, any chance I had to be a little bit mischievous, like Terry Jones said to us early on, he said, my memory's not what it was, as I'm having trouble with some of this. And he had a very difficult speech at one point, and he had it on a piece of card. And on about the third or fourth night, thinking what Eddie'd said, after he'd been reading it off the card, I just said to him for some time, "Yeah, let me read that for you, sir." And I took the card away from him. And of course, we broke up. Gilliam couldn't breathe. He was laughing so much. The audience loved it. And so from then on, we sort of messed around. And no longer was I trying to do the perfect, precise performance with all the stuff. I was just having fun. And when you do that, something communicates itself with the audience, and it just becomes a wonderful experience.
Well, I hope someday to be able to have fun. Sounds wonderful, and I wish that I could have
You do
been
it
there.
so naturally with the audience, but you know, it's because you've done a stand-up and all this kind of thing, right?
A little amount, yeah. But I mean, it's to me it's terrifying, and that's why it's worth doing. And then it becomes fun.
But when you came out here, you were very relaxed, and you got a lot of laughs, and you were completely in charge.
Sorry again. I'm
sorry.
sorry. And I apologize.
I thought to myself, this guy is good.
Oh my God.
Now,
Oh,
how? I want to know, how anxious were you coming out here?
Well, coming out here was easy because I was getting away from you. Because standing next to you is terrifying because
I don't
you know,
understand this rubbish. You people get so kind of, I don't know, awestruck.
Yeah.
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 Awestruck.
That's right.
What about?
Your work has had a profound impact on the way I think and make
Really?
my living. Yeah.
Really?
And
well,
yeah.
that's nice, but you don't have to be frightened. I have no plans to harm you.
I know you have no plans. Well, now maybe we can get some of those cards and we can take some questions from the audience so that you can finally hear the answers to the questions you're interested in, not just the ones I'm
You're
interested in.
going to choose them?
Well, why don't you? And because the purpose of your asking questions is to draw as much attention to you as anyone else, we're going to raise the house lights and we'll acknowledge you.
This is an interesting one, actually. Do you ever miss the collaborative writing process? The answer is I didn't miss it on the book, but normally I love writing with someone. Do you write on your own or with someone?
I write on my own, but working at The Daily Show, I had to learn to write collaboratively.
Yeah.
And it was a very hard skill to adapt to that I'm very glad that I did because it's
Well, you
easier.
see, I find if I write with somebody else, that because we bounce off each other in a completely unpredictable way, we get to places that we would never get to individually.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? That's what I like about the collaboration.
The picture, the word picture that you painted of you and Graham Chapman writing together while you are at the typewriter diligently and he is suntanning himself outside and yelling at you.
Yeah, but that was how it worked.
Yeah.
I mean, I always said with Graham that he was lazy and that there were days when I did 80% of the work and then there were the days when he did 5% of the work. but it worked because he stopped me from getting stuck in slightly too predictable stuff because he'd suddenly throw in a line. I remember him sunbathing on the veranda once. He would throw in a line and you'd say, "Oh yeah, that's it, that's what we need. Wait, let's take those 6 lines out, they're too boring." And then you'd go off in a new direction. So I love writing collaboratively, but I don't think you can do an autobiography collaboratively because suppose if you had a twin. One of the criticisms of the book, we have an alleged newspaper in England called the Daily Mail. And the Daily Mail, I'll tell you an absolutely true story. The Daily Mail and I hate each other. As you probably see, there's some very insulting relations, right?
You say some very mean things about
And
some
they
hard-working journalists.
No, they don't have journalists anymore. They just have people who can spell. Because when you're writing gossip, you don't have to have any kind of writing ability. Do you see what I mean? This makes you cheap to employ. So, where was I?
You were fighting with the Daily Mail.
I was fighting with the Daily Mail, and so the Daily Mail, of course, were going to hate the book.
Sure, right.
So they think, who can we get to do the hatchet job on the book? And they think, well, if we just have one of our staff, then everyone knows that Cleese hates us and we hate Cleese. So that wouldn't be. What we need is someone with real authority, an expert. So
I needed the money.
Yep. And the hatchet review on the book was done by a professor, right? They got a professor. And it was an expert opinion on the book, not an ordinary book review, you see, but because the guy was a professor.
Right. This was not subjective. This was an objective assessment.
It was objective assessment
of book
by
quality
an
from
expert.
a book professor.
Right.
Right.
Now, you won't believe this. Guess what he was a professor of?
Bookology.
Criminology. And he taught at the former Birmingham Polytechnic. Now, you know, if this had been a literary professor, an English professor from Oxford, or a psychology professor from Cambridge, I would have thought he really does have authority. But the best that the Daily Mail could come up with to do the hatchet
Britain's
job.
30th best criminologist weighs in.
Can you imagine the editorial meeting when somebody said, yeah, I got it, I know who's going to write. Let's see if we can find a criminology professor from a really obscure establishment.
But you had studied criminology, didn't you?
I had studied
right, so
criminology.
there you go.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But it still just shows the desperate lengths to which they will go in order to be negative.
Are you going to write more memoirs?
Yes,
Good.
I think I enjoyed it so much because
Yes, please.
I
Yeah.
tell you,
there are many chapters.
Well, some of it's
to be
funny, isn't it? And
it's
when
very funny.
It's a lovely feeling to make yourself laugh.
I especially liked when you just reprinted a bunch of scripts from the 1948 show.
Oh,
That was lovely.
this is
Must have been very easy for you to include
wonderful. Yes, absolutely right. It was so easy. I was embarrassed, and I actually.
No, I was thrilled.
I
actually,
know.
because, yeah.
But I wrote a little thing at the front, which I basically said, you know, I'm going to print these scripts almost whole because they are enormously good, funny sketch material that was done once in 1967.
And the name of the show was you probably all know, but in case you don't, at last, the 1948
show, and it was Marty Feldman and Graham Chapman and Tim Brooke Taylor.
Yeah.
And we did some material, and I recently, they wiped all the shows. Can you believe that? Because on those days, the tapes on which these shows were kept and recorded were that big. They were that wide, that big, like that. And they took up so much space that the Frost organization, who put the shows on, wiped the tapes. And ever since
they needed
then,
shelf space.
They needed
Literally,
shelf
right?
space,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah, so destroy some cultures so we can have some more shelf space.
That's right. That's right. So they wiped it, and then we started discovering the shows. And Marty Feldman died some time ago, and his widow died last year, and she left me 2 shows. And we're showing them in London on December the 7th.
I thought you were going to say, and we destroyed them.
That would have been funny. And the last one, the 12th of the 12 shows that we did, Marty, Graham, Tim, and I, is so like a Monty Python that if I put it on the screen now, you would be astonished. I had no idea how similar it was. So why was I talking about
I don't
that?
know. Well, we were answering questions, but
yes,
we'll
that's
answer some more. But
you can't really. Oh, and the whole point of this, believe it or not, was the Daily Mail, because this expert, the professor of criminology, said in his review of the book that I seem rather self-involved. I am right thinking that's the point. Good question. You choose one.
Why do you think that Monty Python has stood the test of time in the era of the Hangover comedy?
Oh,
The
really?
Hangover style comedy. I think the name of the movie is just The Hangover, not The Hangover comedy.
You see, people ask me, and I don't know. Seriously, I don't know. I mean, you can tell me why you like it, but I will hear you, and you will inform me.
May I take a crack at it?
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
One of the things that struck me was you were talking about writing for David Frost, and that you and Chapman had ideas of going off in increasingly absurdist and surreal situations that they would say, very funny, but it won't play.
Yeah.
And then when you got to do the 1948 show, you could indulge in some of that silliness a little bit.
Take the risks.
And that and I'd like to hear what you have to say about absurdism in comedy. One of the things about it is that it's not pegged to a particular point in time necessarily.
No, that's true.
And even though there are social aspects to Monty Python that are very British and very specific to that era of transition in Britain, it's still funny walks.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's silly.
Yeah, exactly.
Our favorite word was silly when we used to describe it, because they were always call it zany and madcap and all these words. And for us, it was just silly.
Was there ever a silly that was too much silly?
No, because the silliest thing we ever did, everyone adores it. It is utterly without meaning. And it is this fish slapping dance. You know? I mean, he dances up to me and flips me in the chops, and then I hit him with this big fish, and he falls down into the water. I mean, as I say, I always wonder if one day somebody, some poor student will have to write an essay on what that means. You know, it is utterly, utterly meaningless and hilariously funny. So that was
I bet I could find a criminologist who would disagree. Do you have one there that you want to?
Of all the sketches that you and Graham wrote for...
You don't have to take the one off the top.
Which was your favorite? The cheese sketch. I love the cheese sketch. But there's a good story. Should I tell it?
Please.
Yeah, the story about the cheese show, why we wrote it. We were shooting down on the south coast of England because I had to go on a boat dressed as one. Ooh, you know, the pepper pots, one of those. And when I got down there, I was alarmed to see just how rough the sea was. And they said, don't worry, we're not going outside the harbor. We'll put the camera, landside and shoot out, and it'll be the same. And I thought, because I'm not a good sailor. And I got on this boat, and they took me out to the ship, and they, did the makeup and for the pepper pot. And then they said, are you ready? Go downstairs. And I was feeling just terrible. And I had to come up some stairs and just look at the camera and say a line. So I heard action, and I ran at the camera and went, oh, yeah. Right over the camera. Cut. Cleaned up the camera, cleaned up the cameraman, poor chap. They sent me down again. You feeling better? I thought, yes. Oh, yeah, I feel better now. Same thing happened. Straight up, oh, yes. The third time, I didn't have anything to throw up, and I managed to get the line out. I got in a boat, and I went, and you know what seasickness is like? You really,
Nope.
You don't know?
No. But go on.
It's easier to be dead. It really is. And I remember thinking that there were people during the Second World War when we were taking supplies around the north coast of Norway and delivering them to Russia at Murmansk. There were British seamen who died of seasickness. And I just And when I was on the boat, I thought to myself, lucky buggers, And I got back, and when we were driving home back to London some hours later, and I was feeling just a little bit better, Gray said, being a doctor, he said, you should eat something now. And I said, yeah, all right. He said, we could stop and find a shop. Is there anything you feel like? And I said, actually, I'd like some cheese. And Graham said, all right. So we looked for a cheese shop, and we couldn't see anywhere. We passed a chemist, and I said, do you think they'd have cheese? And Graham said, well, if they did, it would be medicinal cheese. And we love the idea of medicinal cheese, you see. So when we got to...
Why don't you start a line of medicinal cheese? You could bring out Cleese's own.
I know, it would be wonderful.
Medicinal cheese.
Well, I am a doctor of laws. It's an honorary degree. And I want to produce...
And your family name is Cheese.
Yes, you're absolutely right. All right, well, I'll put that on hold.
That's all, all right.
So I said to Graham, let's write a story about somebody who goes into a chemist shop and asks for cheese. And then we said, well, why would anybody do that? And then we said, well, obviously, because they've been to a cheese shop, and the cheese shop doesn't have any cheese. So that was the kind of logic by which... The wonderful thing about Gray was that he had the best... He knew when an audience was going to laugh better than I did.
Yeah.
And I kept writing this out. I went into a delicatessen and wrote down the names of all the cheeses. Munster. No, we never have that on a Monday. And then cheddar. Well, there's very little call for that around here. Brie, the cat just ate it, And I kept saying to Graham, is this funny, Graham? And he was sitting there with his pipe. He said, it's funny. I'd go on for about 3 minutes more, and then I'd say to him, are you sure this is funny? It's funny. And if it wasn't for Graham, I would never have written the sketch. But that was a perfect example of one, the stupid way in which we sometimes used an idea, and two, collaboration,
And also that there was a logic to the silliness.
Yes.
In other words, you couldn't just have someone come in to a chemist and ask for cheese. There had to be some dream logic reason for it.
That's right,
that
exactly.
was
Because no matter how mad the premise is, you've got to... Marty Feldman always taught me. He said, you have to obey the internal logic. So if you write, one of my favorite sketches was a young couple going into a furniture shop and they want to buy a bed and a mattress, but when they say the word mattress, the salesman puts a paper bag over his head. I love it. I think that's terribly funny, and he just stands there. They don't know what to do, so they get the department head over, and he comes over and sees the guy there with him. He said, oh, did somebody say the word mattress? They said, yes. He said, it's all right, don't worry, we just have to sing a verse of the hymn in Jerusalem. And he'll take it off. Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. But that logic has to be obeyed. Every time anyone says mattress, he's got to put the bag on.
Yeah.
And he mustn't take it off till they sing Jerusalem. That's what I mean about the internal logic.
I was just thinking, we were talking before about podcasts and radio and how great it is, and I think you may be the only comedian in the universe who does not currently have a podcast. So if the medicinal cheese plan that I've laid out for you doesn't pan out,
right, I
think you could do a podcast, which is John Cleese describes Monty Python sketches.
All right.
And just, of course, it's a podcast, so you'd have to charge nothing for it. I don't know how you'd make any money off of it, but...
Well, that would be fun. Once I paid the alimony off, I'm going to go...
I think if you charge $1 per download, done.
Really? All right.
Yeah.
I'll find out about it. I don't understand that world. I wrote the book. with a propelling pencil made by Papermate, a little yellow plastic propelling pencil, into an exercise
A
book.
mechanical pencil?
It was
I'm going to have to get a custom
Yes,
sharpened pencil.
No, I
for
would
you.
say yes. It was a machine after
Yeah,
a fall.
right.
Yeah, and I wrote that and then it was what I really liked about it is if I made a mistake, there was this funny little thing on the end, and if you took it and rubbed it on the bit, it would go away. This is about
Sounds
the height
like savagery.
This is as far as I go in technology.
All right. I've got another story I can tell you that's not in the book.
Tell me.
No, I can't. But it's about podcasts and never mind. Salad, a meal or
would
not?
we like to hear this?
No, I can't.
Yes.
I can't.
Yeah,
I
I think we need to hear
I
this
can't tell it
story.
because it involves
What?
making fun of.
I'm telling you to do
No,
it!
All right, I will.
Good. You don't mind if I have a pee, do you?
No, not at all. All right, everyone, settle in. This is a good one. You were at The Daily Show. You may have met Paul Mercurio, who is a very talented comedian who warms up the audience for The Daily Show every night. He's brilliant at it, a brilliant crowd worker, very, very funny guy, and he has a podcast. Sir Paul McCartney, you've heard of him, was on the Colbert Report sometime recently, and Paul went over to see him and got to chatting with Paul McCartney and said to Paul McCartney, "You should be on my podcast." And Paul McCartney said, "You know, they're telling me I should get involved in podcasts. You're obviously a near 50-year-old millennial. I'll do it." And Paul Mercurio said, "Okay, well, I'll get my information to your assistant." He said, "No, let me just take your number and I'll call you." And Paul was like, "Okay." Paul Mercurio said, "Okay," and he went home. And 2 days later, telephone call from Paul McCartney. I got 25 minutes. Let's do this." And it's, look, I got a podcast. If Paul McCartney's going to be on anyone's podcast, it should be me. I just was polite enough not to go harass him backstage at the Colbert Report and trick him into thinking that I was going to be his entree to the world of youth that is controlled by 43 to 50-year-old white guys. So I'm just thinking that I could be your Paul Mercurio. I'll record a few of these things and I'll put it out there and I'll cut you in for 5%. Now, this is a pressing issue. And this person swears that he or she wrote this before you brought up salads. Question, salad, a meal or not a meal? Does a salad count as a meal?
No.
No. All right, good. Moving on. One trick interviewing questions.
This one's blank.
Yeah. Oh, you make that one up.
I know. Can you please give me a demonstration of a silly walk? I'm 75. Do you ever miss the collaborative writing process?
It's funny they came up with that individually themselves.
Yeah.
You should do silly sits now.
Oh, that's very good.
Someone's getting this down, right? Medicinal cheese, silly sits.
Yeah, that's very funny.
I'm going to be in charge of your merch.
Podcasts.
Do you realize just how much joy you have brought to so many people?
No.
Bob Storm from Carbondale, Pennsylvania, you have driven far to be properly humiliated. Do you have another?
Yes, what do you eat for breakfast every day?
Every day.
Every day. Well, I eat. I'm not very strong at cooking. It's not, but I actually have a way of preparing cornflakes, which I find is really good because it takes a little day. You may find this useful. What you do You have to take the top off the packet to start with, and then inside there's a sort of plastic packet.
Now that's where I usually get hung up.
Do you?
Yeah.
Well, the key is you take that out and you cut a little bit off the top with a pair of scissors. I mean, you could do it with a knife, but it's easier with a pair. Then you get a bowl and you put the bowl there, and then you take and you invert it.
Inversion.
Allowing the force of gravity to encourage the flakes to fall into the bowl.
And that aerates them as well?
It aerates them and slightly warms them up. Then you go to the refrigerator and you take out a bottle of milk or a carton of milk.
Sure.
And you basically employ the same principle of gravity. Then you put it in the oven and bake it.
You know what? Somewhere in Minnesota, that is a recipe. Cornflake hot dish.
I have a PA from the Middle West, and he has never eaten a salad in his life. Isn't that true, Howard? True, yes. I ate his vegetables off his plate at dinner last night.
Did you go through all of these? They're all fine. I'll do them. Let's do it. You know what? Just for fun.
All right.
Let's do a very
What was the date of the birth? No, death. Sorry. What was the date of the death of Cardinal Richelieu? 1642. Yeah, 1642. That's right. Is this a piece of your brain? How does the separation of a common language have an impact on comedy through several generations as you've observed it? Very little difference at all. I actually think the English sense of humor, American sense of humor is very similar, except that in parts of the Midwest and the South, you do not have irony. Right? And the sad thing is that in England, we have little else.
That's what you have to pour on your cornflakes when milk isn't available. Just a little irony.
Little irony.
Yeah, indeed.
I like that. Using gravity.
Do you have any scars?
Then you can eat the cornflakes, you see. When you bake them, you take them out, and then you can eat them using what we call, in English, a spoon.
I'm not sure I deserve to eat them.
He's a very silly man, isn't he?
I don't deserve that pleasure. Do you have any scars? And if so, how did you get them?
I do have a scar. I've got quite a lot of scars. In fact, I'm virtually bionic now because I have an artificial hip, so I have a scar just there. And then I have an artificial knee. Now, the people who are easily upset should close their eyes at this point. Look at that fucking scar there. Look at the size
Good
of
heavens, yeah.
That was a complete knee replacement. It was the most miserable experience I had in my life. It took 2 years to heal. Then I had diverticular, and I've had a tonsillectomy, which didn't leave much in the way of scars, and I had an appendix taken out. So I have at least 5 scars, four scars.
I presume countless emotional scars.
Oh, countless. Countless with my mother. Interesting, quite seriously.
It's interesting. I just see this one about separation of a common language, and at the bottom it said also, special PS to John Hodgman. I love your podcast. You didn't read that part. It's all right. You can keep that for later. Who are your favorite female comedians?
Margaret Thatcher.
But you had an interesting
The only
observation in the book about French and Saunders sort of breaking
wonderful.
barriers.
Absolutely
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I like them both enormously, and I worked with them both. And the lovely thing was that they were the first time that they were the funniest people, funniest girls, much funnier than any of the men.
Right.
And that was a wonderful moment. And it was because they they could really let themselves go, as well as just being funny.
Yeah.
So they were great. And I adore Megan Mullally.
Sure.
You know, Megan, I did 6 Will and Graces with her, and it was one of the
She's
best.
doing a show here in New York, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's doing a show here in New York right now.
You won't believe this. I was filmed with her today. When Cambridge Circus came to Broadway, we were on at a theatre called the Plymouth, which is now the, what's it called? Schoenberg. Schoenfeld. So I went to the old dressing room, which happens to be the one that she's in now, doing a play there, and she and I did an interview together and chatted. I absolutely
She's very funny.
adore the woman. She's one of the nicest people I've ever met. Incredible voice. And I'd actually love to perform with her. I think she's just terrific. Who else is good? Joan Rivers, wasn't she wonderful? Wasn't she wonderful? I introduced a show a few years ago, a sort of variety show at the Wimbledon Theatre for Prince Charles's 60th birthday, and I was the host. And Joan Rivers made Prince Charles laugh more than anyone else on the bill. She's just wonderful. Elaine, what was Mike Nichols' partner? Elaine May. Elaine May, I thought was absolutely wonderful. Who makes you laugh most?
Well, just because we're talking about women, Maria Bamford is an incredible performer that I think you would enjoy. And then the person who makes me laugh the most and is so influential on me that I am terrified of stealing from him all the time, aside from you, is Paul F. Tompkins. He's very, very talented. And then, of course, we have Wyatt Cenac here in the audience, too, you guys, from The Daily Show. And I don't know. There's a lot of great comedy.
There's a lot of great comedy and a dearth of great comedy executives.
They would disagree with you.
Oh, I know. But you see, one of the things I've discovered, and I'm being quite genuine now, is as you get older, you realize that almost nobody knows what they're talking about. And I include myself in that statement, because people really do think they know. Yeah. You should read a book called Black Swan. It's absolutely fascinating. But I'm a phony professor at Cornell, and I have a friend there called David Dunning. And David has he's a social psychologist, and he's done a marvelous amount he's been fascinated by how, when people are good or not so good at something, how accurate is their self-assessment? Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Do they know how good or bad they are? And they've discovered something which I think is one of the most enlightening things I've ever heard in my life. In order to know how good you are at something requires almost exactly the same skills as it does to be good at that thing in the first place. So that if you're absolutely no good at something, you lack exactly the skills that you need to know that you're no fucking use at it. And that explains everything. You see, but it's not that the TV executives have no idea what they're doing, but the sad thing is that they have no idea that they have no idea what they're doing. And that permeates our society, that simple principle. And so few people know what they're doing that it's best to assume that nobody does.
I have one last question, just a point of curiosity, because we're just about out of time.
Mm-hmm.
This is from your book.
Oh, good. Right.
You wrote... Well, we don't have to do it, actually. It's fine.
No, come on.
No, that's fine.
Come on.
The book, everything is... You're very candid and forthright throughout the book.
Yep, except...
And then you write this line. that kind of goes unexplained. I've always had an extensive collection of soft toys,
Yes.
meaning stuffed animals, what we would call stuffed
They're
animals.
stuffed animals. I call them stuffed animals.
And then in parentheses, you write, by way of explanation, I buy them pretending that they are for children. And then you just go on to something else. Is this still true? Do you have a lot of stuffed animals?
I will tell you something very, very touching. I'm very happily married at long last. And it's a wonderful experience. And it may give you hope, some of you, if you had as many disastrous relationships as I had. It may give you hope to know that I met Jenny I think I was nearly 70. And I love her to bits. And we walked past each other in the street, stopped, turned round, and started talking. So if either of us had not turned round, it wouldn't happen. So extraordinary. Those of you who read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell will know these things are possible. But what I discovered, which indeed, she's not only the best swimmer I've ever seen, I call her Fish, but she has an enormous collection of stuffed animals. And when we put our collection together, there was hardly room for anyone to get into the apartment. we have a current assessment is that we've got about 80. And they sit all around the apartment in all sorts of places, on lamps and so forth, and every single one of them makes a smile. And it's a lovely feeling. We look at them and they just amuse me. And then we have the three biggest cats in Europe, the Maine Coons.
Sure.
And this is all I need. I need Jenny, occasional food, 3 cats, and soft toys, and I'm happy.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Cleese. What a pleasure.
That was fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Technically, oh.